fiction. And we found bones of giant dinosaurs. This is a sea serpent part here. These were all found in my backyard here. And they all represent finds from a period that we call the pre-credulous period, the point in time when people will believe just about anything.
Behind his assumed identity as a scientist, Clayton Bailey received a notoriety attained by few ceramic artists before him. Among the prestigious honors bestowed him, he received an invitation to be the artist in residence at the Kohler Toilet Factory in Sheboygan, Michigan. He humbly accepted, and his contributions there were felt immediately.
Toilet teapot. I made this when I was an artist in residence at the toilet factory in Sheboygan. I thought maybe they'd appreciate having a teapot, so if there was a downturn in construction, they could still sell toilets to people.
After a 200-year struggle to find legitimacy, American clay art had come to this.
I don't think they ever started producing this.
Clay artists begin at an intrinsic disadvantage by choosing a nature-based material in a culture in which nature-based living is history, is gone. But great artists always take disadvantages and make them the basis of their work. So if you're working with a disadvantage and can transform that disadvantage into an asset, then you've really got something going. And that's what Peter Voulkos did, and that's what Ken Price did, and that's what Adrian Sachs did.
Elegant, erotic, subtle, and confused, the vessels of Adrian Sachs at once entice and defy. In the process of making a teapot, Sachs assembles a collage of historical symbols and produces an object rife with cultural collisions. Whether using the tools of the potter, the jeweler, or the dumpster diver, Sachs sets the icons of privilege opposite the debris of poverty to make complex, peculiar vessels in tune with an age of contradiction. From his stance as the potter of popular culture, Sachs crouches gently into his seat amidst the porcelain gods.
I first started thinking about college and a life's work in the sciences, particularly chemistry. But I found myself spending all my time and energy working with ceramics, which in fact had a big science component to it. And so I started making pots. After a number of years of working in ceramics, I was looking for somebody that I could attach to as a mentor, as a hero. And when I was ready to take that journey, I was looking to Voulkos, actually, as many other young ceramists were. And it didn't work out because I had an automobile accident. So then I had to find my own way.
If you were going to bust up the tradition of ceramics, there are essentially two ways you could go. One was physical, which is the route that Voulkos took. And the other way you could go was conceptual, with the idea of what ceramics was and what ceramics stood for and embodied. If you imagine that you want to make a pot, the thing that you do is take a lump of clay and slap it down on a wheel, and you have this disorganized mess, which you then begin to spin. And at some point in pushing that wet clay around, suddenly everything clicks into place, and it becomes what they call centered. Well, this feeling of centering clay on a wheel is pretty terrific. I mean, it sort of makes everything right with the world. What artists like Adrian do, I think, is begin with that centering, that wonderful centering, and then they attempt to decenter it. They attempt to destabilize what your expectations are.
Merci. Adrian's artwork quite often goes over the heads of the people who see his work. Many people respond at the level of the beauty of the glaze. Many respond because of the complexity of the form or the interest of the form, or they're drawn in by some interesting contrast which makes them giggle. If they really were to look at it and study his work and get to know his entire production, they may be insulted a bit by what Adrian is really talking about.
At some point in the late 60s, early 70s, Adrian was doing what a lot of studio potters do in order to survive, and that is producing dinnerware to sell at craft fairs or whatever to make money. And it occurred to him that there was a significant difference in the kinds of things he was making. He could make a plate out of stoneware and then make exactly the same plate out of porcelain. No difference between them except the kind of clay in which he was using, and he could get a heck of a lot more money for the porcelain plate than he could get for the stoneware plate. Why was that? Well, porcelain has a certain tradition, stoneware has a certain tradition. Stoneware has certain plebeian aspects or associations. Porcelain has certain upper-class associations, which have nothing to do with the two plates that Adrian was making. Yet people valued them differently because of their histories.
What Adrian did was a little different. He began to play with traditions which were actually verboten.
It wasn't clear to me, but I really got very intrigued in all of the social history of porcelain and all the symbols of power and wealth and status that they could express and, in fact, become visual signposts for.
So Adrian followed this dichotomy between stoneware and porcelain back to the origins, to the Sèvres porcelain factory outside Paris, a place where in the late 18th century the absolute mania for porcelain among the French aristocracy eventually bankrupted the entire French state and lit one of the fuses to the French Revolution.
What we have to remember is court porcelains were objects of power and prestige. Owning these objects indicated a certain refinement, indicated a certain class, and indicated, quite simply, a clout within their culture. So when you look at court porcelains, these are instruments of power, and in many cases, instruments of greed. And this is a kind of subtle undertext that is there in almost all of Adrian's work.
Porcelain is a luxury medium. It is considered the queen of the clay bodies. Now, Adrian's use of porcelain when he first began was criticized by other potters who felt that it was an elitist material. But Adrian Sachs's main goal is to communicate the ideas behind his work. To that end, he uses humor, he uses titles that augment the meaning of his work, and he uses a mix of forms that are from any place that he can find them.
There's a piece of Adrian's, a beautiful blue jar with gold buttons on it. And this piece speaks about a particular moment in history when the French Revolution came, the monarchy was torn down, and how the Sèvres porcelains were actually one of the great indulgences of the king and one of the things that brought down an entire dynasty.
He's trying to seduce the viewer into coming toward the object because it looks like it's a rich object, and that they are, in fact, being seduced by this obvious play to their avarice. He is manipulating the audience to get them to value his work. And he does it through imitation jewels, he does it through the application of lusters and gold and things that look rich and refer to rich histories. And then he often undercuts the viewer by confusing your expectations.
I'm always playing with people's expectations, and sometimes I want to lead people to think that something functions in one way and then do something that's contradictory. In other words, if you're operating a pot with a lid, if you're removing the lid or thinking about putting something inside one of my pots, and all of a sudden you find that you're handling a douche wand in the normal place a handle might be, then it becomes surprising. So I started bringing that into my work.
Adrian is a brave artist in that he will tackle topics that are not normally considered within the realm of fine art.
Everybody knows about feces. It's a universal experience. And not only do they know about their own, but people are generally concerned about their dogs and their cats and their babies and their grandparents and their siblings and their spouses. And so it's something that people think a lot more about than they would like to admit or make the subject of polite conversation. So I think it's something that that is worth, addressing in some work.
Well, I mean, clay looks like shit. It looks like it, feels like it. Certainly Adrian has been very conscious of that and makes the case very explicitly by putting these sort of lovely porcelain objects on top of these clumps of fecal matter.
Adrian's work is a mass of contradictions, both physically and conceptually. He can fire in a single piece both porcelain and stoneware, which technically is quite a feat. And at the same time, he can put the most exquisitely handmade flourish on a pot that the whole thing just takes off.
Now, Adrian is a bit of a techie. He knows his chemistry, he knows his various glaze technologies inside and out. But I think he gets a little giggle out of putting in front of his audience beautifully made, elegantly conceived objects that often refer to things that are not discussed in polite society.
I like to get people engaged on one level through purely sensual appeal and get them involved in that and then gross them out. But it's not to gross them out, it's to undermine their assumptions about what something is.
Adrian's work is also always conscious of being some kind of vessel, and vessels by their nature are meant to be used. But they're so beautifully made that you have to think twice before you would think about picking up an Adrian Sachs teapot. And that double take is something that makes you very self-conscious. It is so exquisite and often made from such junk. Adrian takes the great disadvantage of working with clay to such an extreme of perfection and craziness, which one would think would be opposing ideas. And they work. They somehow come together.
During the mid-century, a vessel was supposed to simply be a vessel. It was to be about form and containing and glaze. As time has gone on and clay has been opened up to deal with other kinds of topics, Adrian's work, with its social content, has been offensive to those who are enamored with the notion of the vessel being just a vessel.
Adrian's pots set up a great visual, semiotic, and historical clamor of different motifs, traditions, referential and invented forms. There's a quality to Adrian's pots of uncertainty about what it is they are. Are they pots? Are they trophies, display objects?
Adrian's work is really a mass of contradictions, and one of the fundamental dichotomies that Adrian manages to bring together in his work is the one between something sinister and something erotic, which I think is also very much of its time, of the 80s and 90s. That kind of marriage of eroticism and sinister qualities can be seen within the context of the era of AIDS, of body questions in political life having to do with abortion. So in the same way that you can look at historical examples of Sèvres pottery and read the society of late 18th century France, you can look at Adrian's pots and read the society of late 20th century America.
It's about a kind of terminal self-consciousness, a kind of catastrophe of self-consciousness. There's a kind of running off the edge of a cliff quality to their self-consciousness. It's sort of like somebody being asked what they know and trying to tell you everything all at once. They're not comfortable. They're not comfortable to look at or think about. He's as much as tipping his hand, confessing his discomfort in a way that evokes something of a common condition. I mean, his works are very timely to the end of the 20th century.
Looking across cultures and across time, I came to this realization that I could draw on every tradition because we had no particular tradition that I could draw on. I don't even have any religious or secular traditions that are easily recognizable. But what I'm really trying to do, ultimately, is make something where all of these differences are understood to be natural conditions for our times. I'm really like a village potter, but I characterize it as I'm the village potter for the global village because we're drawing on every tradition and no tradition and creating new awarenesses and new ways of working.